The Sony PlayStation embarked on a mission to revolutionize the video game industry. Not only did it successfully challenge the industry, but it changed everything. Unable to control his fury, Oga replied, "If you really mean it, prove to me that it's possible." Then he formed a fist and pounded it on his desk and shouted, "Do it." The PlayStation owes its very existence to the talented engineer Ken Kutaragi, a talented businessman, engineer, and innovative thinker whose actions and vision led to the system's ultimate creation and market dominance. His actions stem from a deep desire to create an innovative business within Sony, creating something that would contribute immensely to the company's profits and prestige. If it wasn't for Ken Kutaragi, the empire built by PlayStation would never have existed. Ken Kutaragi was a rare combination of research skill and business acumen. The PlayStation project that he would launch was a combination of cutting-edge 3D graphics and an innovative business strategy. The PlayStation exists because of these traits. What was created challenged everything that existed within the video game industry, and it even challenged the fundamental relations that existed within the Sony Corporation and its associated subsidiaries. But before the mighty PlayStation dominated store shelves and the imagination of gamers everywhere, it was an unproven brand that when it first emerged was about to go head-to-head with the juggernauts of the gaming industry, Sega and Nintendo, companies who would vie against one another for years trying to dominate the game space. And now Sony was about to enter that fight with its PlayStation, which the PlayStation in itself had a very unique relationship, owing its birth to Nintendo as its origins came from a failed CD add-on agreement. This is a story of how Ken Kutaragi, through sheer force of will, managed to challenge the establishment at Sony and launch one of the most successful gaming consoles in history. Player 1. The inspiration for the PlayStation stemmed from Ken Kutaragi's interest in cutting-edge technology and its innovation in consumer products. His interest in the video game market grew when he observed his daughter playing the Nintendo Famicom. He noticed that even when he offered his daughter the technically more complex MSX computer system, she wasn't as interested and gravitated towards the Famicom. The Famicom offered more colors and a different experience that was unique to the home console, which that observation led him to seeing video game consoles were something that was not only here to stay, but would become a staple of the home living room. Something else equally profound occurred in 1984 as well, when Ken Kutaragi saw the Sony System G, a computer graphics system that allowed for real-time 3D graphics that could be controlled and articulated by the user. The System G was used in television for real-time 3D graphics on broadcasts. The device had a price tag around $350,000. Ken Kutaragi was so taken by the system that he was truly inspired by its capabilities. He saw it as something that was only the beginning. In his mind, he was already drawing the framework for the 3D games that would eventually take the gaming industry by storm. After seeing the System G in late '84-'85, he predicted that 3D graphics of that caliber would be available to your average consumer by 1995. With the benefit of hindsight, we know he was just about spot on in terms of his market prediction. Sparks of interest. Ken Kutaragi watching his daughter play the Famicom gave him a deep respect and interest in Nintendo's technology and their process. He knew Sony had technology that could be sold to Nintendo to profit from the growing game industry. So he started by convincing Nintendo to use Sony's SPC 700 sound chip in the Super Nintendo console, Nintendo's successor to the much-lauded Nintendo Entertainment System. Ken Kutaragi was actually almost fired for working this deal with Nintendo, as he'd gone behind the backs of Sony leadership to do it. Oga, a ranking Sony executive, intervened and saved him. Oga's faith in Ken Kutaragi would become a recurring theme throughout his career. If Sony had fired him for this minor affront, the gaming landscape as we know it today would have been dramatically different. Nintendo's Betrayal. The story of the PlayStation can't be told without mentioning the betrayal that led to its ultimate rise as a standalone brand. The PlayStation was at first a CD add-on for Nintendo's Super Famicom. The deal between Nintendo and Sony started out promising, but eventually soured as Nintendo realized they were inviting Sony right into the kingdom without a fight. Nintendo deliberately and very publicly betrayed Sony at CES in 1991. Nintendo ended up working in agreement with Philips to develop the CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, but that Philips add-on never ended up seeing the light of day. Ken Kutaragi had actually pitched the idea for Nintendo to use compact discs for the next console as early as 1987. Nintendo at that time was hesitant because of the failure of their disk drive system, so work on getting Nintendo to align with Ken Kutaragi's vision took some work. He was, however, diligent in his efforts, eventually getting Nintendo on board. As we know now, things did not go as planned. The whirlwind around that pivotal moment in gaming history is pretty fascinating, as Sony's public relations director learned of Nintendo's change of heart days before CES was actually set to begin, which differs dramatically from how the story is often told, where it's often described as a complete surprise to Sony in other popular retellings. Ken Kutaragi learned of the deal falling apart while traveling across Japan, which just about immediately prompted him into renting a business room on the Shikansen and trying to contact Nintendo and attempt to salvage the deal while there was still time. He even tried to contact Philips, but didn't get anywhere meaningful in conversation. On the first day of CES 1991, Sony decided to announce their partnership with Nintendo anyway, thinking that there still might be a chance to potentially strong-arm Nintendo back to their senses. Only for the very next morning to have Howard Lincoln march onto stage and announce Nintendo was now partnering with Philips. Ironically, elements within Sony actually wanted the CD-ROM venture to fail, as there were departments within Sony that were actively developing for the CDI format. In what could be considered an intentionally traumatizing display, Sony was stabbed not in the back, but in the face, very publicly. Worst part being that Sony saw the betrayal coming. What makes the event traumatic is that Sony has been openly working on the hardware for this deal since January 1st of 1989. A development contract bearing the signatures of Sony president Nori Oga and Nintendo's Hiroshi Yamauchi had been already signed. Prototype consoles had already been produced, and profit deals were being negotiated, and hands had already been shaken. However, Nintendo realized that they were opening themselves up to Sony taking the lion's share of the deal, so they backed out when they felt it was most convenient. However, that wasn't the complete end to the Sony-Nintendo deal. The deal actually limped on until about 1992, with Sony trying to salvage it. The deal with Philips and Nintendo, on the other hand, was seen by Ken Kutaragi as a ploy to break the deal with Sony, prompting talks to end between Sony and Nintendo in May of 1992. Ken Kutaragi's bitterness being described as palpable over the entire event. In the book Revolutionaries at Sony, he said he was frustrated and exhausted from the failed deal, but the ultimate end of that deal was him realizing that Sony had to do it themselves in order to be successful. Ken Kutaragi wasn't going to take that event laying down, and began making moves internally for Sony to develop their own home console. In the book The Console Wars, the story is told roughly in the same way, with Betrayal sparking the system's ultimate creation. The book The Console Wars states that the event led to Sony collaborating with other parties in the game space, namely Sega. Those discussions resulting in Sega and Sony flirting with a joint console deal. However, the discussions fell apart due to what was described as differences of corporate cultures. However, in the book Revolutionaries at Sony, Ken Kutaragi states that no such deals with Sega were ever seriously discussed. An interview released in 2018 with Sony and other Sega Japanese executives states that talks did happen, but they didn't really reach any serious deal outside of initial meetings. Going solo. Sony historically made a large number of different consumer products. Sony had elements within their leadership that really weren't too keen on the idea of starting a new business. However, Ken Kutaragi had the absolute faith of Sony president Oga, who famously smashed his fist on a desk during a meeting with Ken and Sony staff, yelling, "Do it." Oga issuing a decree to Ken Kutaragi to prove his claims that Sony was capable of building a revolutionary game home console, which ultimately would be more than just a CD-based system with a serious focus on 3D graphics. It would be something that challenged all conventions of the video game industry. Sales, distribution, production, and design would be fundamentally challenged. Ken went over the Sony board mainly with strong support from Oga. It was stated by Oga, Ken Kutaragi is far too talented. He needs to be moved away from Sony headquarters as he's butted heads with far too many people, and opposition for him to accomplish his task would be far too great. As a result, Ken would be moved with a team of 9 to Sony Music, where he would have the autonomy he needed. It also had the added benefit of a large amount of in-house knowledge that existed regarding the CD format, which proved pivotal because of their experience in the CD production and distribution. The use of CD as a primary format for the PlayStation changed everything. The compact disc as a format played directly into Sony's strengths. The Sony Music division that had heavily invested in the CD format was extremely well positioned to teach the game division just how effective CDs could be in challenging the industry norms. Not only was it technology that Sony had helped develop, it was something that Sony had positioned themselves in the means of mass production. The CD challenged the price standards of the game industry by simply being cheaper. It was a third cheaper than a cartridge, running at about $9, with a traditional game cartridge ran about $30. perhaps the most single important thing the CD represented to Sony was the ability to repeat production. For the first time, a game could be produced directly to meet consumer demand. Production could be scaled directly if a game was a huge success. Such a feat was impossible with a cartridge, as cartridges required a dramatically longer lead time in production, resulting in game makers ordering either too little, resulting in a game selling out and being unable to meet demand, or the dreaded over-ordering, and there being too many games left on store shelves. The feat of repeat production dramatically lowered the financial risk for game makers if they worked with Sony, so it quickly became a dominant feature of winning over game publishers, where game makers could work with Sony and spend less and get an equal or greater share of the profits. Sega, despite having used CD-ROMs as a game medium, were unable to take full advantage of that format, as Sega didn't have access to the same logistical capabilities that Sony did. So Sega, as a result, was stuck to the whims of a wholesaler model that had been so thoroughly dominated by Nintendo in the past. The book, The Revolutionaries at Sony, defines the situation as: low cost means a low investment. Consider the following example. In the case of Mask ROM, the OEM price is $30 per copy, $300,000 for 10,000 units, $1.8 million for 60,000 units. There is a lag between the actual sale and when the software producer receives the proceeds. So the company has to have enough working capital to operate during this period. In the case of the PlayStation, however, the manufacturing cost of a CD-ROM is $9 per copy, $540,000 for 60,000 units. This cost advantage would be appreciated by software makers who had the creative ability but lacked capital. Unlike the 3DO, Sony had the ability to make the CD-ROMs and could manage every aspect of the process and ensure consumer demands could be strategically met, as Sony understood and built a business plan that saw software as equally important as hardware in terms of how the game console was sold. However, Sony needed a strong lineup of developers to make games for their new console and take advantage of this new distribution model. Press start to join the console war. On October 27, 1993, Sony publicly announced they were entering the console wars with their own CD-based console. This new system was free of any other masters, and its only loyalty was the Sony Corporation. Only downside, the new console was alone in its fight to take over the console market. It didn't have any veteran company to hold its hand. The new console's victory at that time wasn't a sure thing, as it was up against well-established companies. In the mid-1990s, multimedia as a concept was all the rage. A multimedia machine was thought to be the future of the home living room, a console that would be your family computer, VCR, and game machine. However, only a couple of systems tried to sell themselves that way. The 3DO was the primary console on the market making that claim, that it was a multimedia machine despite its primary focus being a game console. The PCFX from NEC was marketed as a multimedia machine as well. The Philips CDI was more akin to a multimedia machine than the 3DO in the sense that the CDI was intended to actually replace those items in your home. However, the CDI, like the 3DO, was expensive and its sales suffered as a result. It was thought that the 3DO was going to sell 1 million units within its first year, but it actually barely managed to sell 200,000 units in Japan. As a result, its time on the market was limited. The thought behind the 3DO's bad sales might have been because of the press kits for the 3DO, stating, "It had games for enthusiasts and hobbyists, with games about golf and such activities, and the console didn't really offer a multimedia experience." The team behind the PlayStation knew that they wouldn't be marketing on the multimedia gimmick for their system. It was going to be first and foremost a game console. What was clear to Sony about the 3DO's failure was that the system needed to be straightforward, a game machine, and they needed to get third-party publishers on board. The 3DO offered a pretty cheap licensing model for game publishers, but it wasn't offering Sony's repeat production model or the PlayStation's unique focus on 3D graphics. However, many third-party developers didn't believe unadulterated 3D was even possible on a dedicated home console at that point in time. Ken Kutaragi knew that 3D graphics were the way to go from the very beginning for the platform, and his prediction of commercial-grade graphics coming into the home 10 years after 1983 were becoming more and more true the closer the eventual launch of the PlayStation came. Sony approached a number of third-party developers in Japan to try and garner interest in their platform. Many were hesitant to jump on board. However, one company was very interested in at least talking with Sony about their proposition. Namco, a company that had a storied history in the game industry, wanted to get in on the action. Notably, they'd been let down by Nintendo when they lost their preferential status. They also had an existing rivalry with Sega as an arcade manufacturer, so Namco had a very vested interest in striking back at both Sega and Nintendo. The home game space offered Namco a unique opportunity. They had been working internally on their own 3D platform, the System 22, for their arcade business, which offered a powerful 3D arcade experience, but it was a rather expensive endeavor. leading Namco to question how Sony could make a 3D game system for a home console that didn't cost a small fortune. And that was where the initial meeting with Sony hung up, simply on the fact that Namco just couldn't believe Sony could do it. The release of Virtua Fighter stunned everyone into believing. Virtua Fighter's release in arcades truly reshaped the popular opinions at Namco that fluid 3D graphics were not only possible, but extremely fast and energetic gameplay was also possible. The 3D polygons of the game were shaped and visually interesting, but most of all, made for an enjoyable gameplay experience. Namco, after seeing Virtua Fighter, knew that that type of gameplay was not only possible, but was touted as coming to Sega's new home console, the Saturn, which led Namco to becoming more eager into jumping into a deal with Sony. Namco's involvement with the Sony PlayStation opened the doors to other developers, as Namco's involvement gave the system more credibility. One of Namco's greatest early contributions to the PlayStation was Ridge Racer. Developed on Namco's System 22, it was ported over to the PlayStation, and its high-quality graphics for that time put 3D racers on the map. Sony chose to push the console as a truly enjoyable home experience, including high-quality audio along with high-end 3D graphics. However, Sony was concerned that the system would potentially tarnish Sony's overall brand image, because game systems were often considered toys by much of the public. Sony wanted to make it clear that they were selling a hi-fi piece of equipment that would not only be the pinnacle of 3D graphics technology, but also gameplay as well. However, Sony didn't push the Sony brand much in the initial marketing for the system, instead pushing the PlayStation as a selling point. Many consumers saw Sony's involvement as a sign of quality, and were on board because of that alone. PSX was used in the initial marketing push for the console, but that was eventually dropped in favor of just the PlayStation. Making something great. Ken Kutaragi recruited more than 10 digital technologists from Sony's various research institutes. For starting up the PlayStation hardware division, Ken Kutaragi wanted the system to take advantage of the knowledge Sony already had in-house involving 3D graphics. Playing off the old System G architecture for design inspiration, parallel processing was seen as the strength of the system's ultimate 3D experience. The System G, despite being built a decade before, was still very much an innovative 3D machine, which had a number of helpful design philosophies behind its inception. And those ideas assisted with the PlayStation 1's design. The PlayStation hardware division built a powerful system, a system whose architecture was built on the philosophy of allowing creators to bring out the full potential of the hardware. And that was the overall goal of the system. One of the most difficult parts of PlayStation was the scale of its production. The system had 750 parts when the first model was released. The silicon for the system had to be produced in massive quantities to sustain production. So many things in the PlayStation design were streamlined the longer it went along. However, when they first started designing the PlayStation, careful consideration had to be made about what chips they would use in its design, and factoring in Moore's Law a bit in terms of predicting how performance would hold up over a forecasted amount of time. Moore's Law being that CPU power doubles roughly every 18 months. A game console with a heavy use of computer components would not be immune forever from being surpassed by future chips, which was a factor in Ken Kutaragi's predictions about the System G, and it eventually leading to a 3D platform roughly 10 years after its inception. System memory was another battle for the PlayStation, as the cost of memory was volatile and caused considerable heartburn around the time the system was in development, with the cost of memory soaring at one point causing concerns that the PlayStation would cost too much to produce. Considering at the peak of the PlayStation 1's production it was eating up almost 33% of the global memory production capabilities, the cost of memory was something that Ken Kutaragi gambled on. However, he knew in his mind that the price of memory would eventually go down once the supply reached the level of demand. So he pushed forward with the specs that he felt were the best for the system. In the end, Sony designed something revolutionary. Not in that it was the most powerful 3D system, but in that it was designed with a philosophy of economy of force, where the system could focus its strengths and do well in those areas. The overall design was smart in the sense that it could be streamlined over time. The first PlayStation model had over 750 parts, and over time the production lines at Sony factories became bottlenecked, where they could only produce around 300,000 units a month. The solution to increase production wasn't to add a production line to the factory. It was to actually redesign the PlayStation itself. Ken Kutaragi and his team reworked the PlayStation architecture to allow the number of parts to be lowered. In doing so, the effect was twofold. It increased production up to 700,000 units on the same production line, and also decreased the cost of the PlayStation. It worked out masterfully, as it allowed for the slashing of prices of retailers for the PlayStation, increasing demand and sales of the unit. The Sega Saturn, on the other hand, because of its complex design, couldn't adjust as well, and was unable to lower its prices quickly or adjust production to lower the cost. For all of Ken Kutaragi's success convincing Sony President Oga to go along with his plans for the PlayStation, there was one interesting fight that derailed the PlayStation's design for a bit. Oga insisted that the PlayStation need a CD caddy for any of the CDs put into the console, believing that since the game console was predominantly going to be used by children, that the games would quickly be worn out if CDs were just exposed to the elements and the digits of children. Kutaragi, on the other hand, believed that such a choice would dramatically impact production speed and the system's overall cost, which he was completely right. Adding a caddy system to the PlayStation adds an extra level of complexity that simply wasn't needed. After many fights with Oga on the issue, Kutaragi eventually prevailed, with Oga eventually relenting despite his concerns. He did, however, make one demand. The PlayStation's media needed to be different from other CDs. Oga had wanted the caddies because it would also allow Sony to have a unique look for their games, and how the same way with Nintendo cards being unique. So a compromise was worked out. The dull silver of traditional CDs wasn't unique enough for the PlayStation. The PlayStation adopted black for all of its games, making it a defining feature. Fun by design. Ken Kutaragi once remarked that they spent as much time designing the PlayStation's controller as they did designing the system itself. The controller, designed by Teiyu Goto, took on a revolutionary design for the era. Goto, however, said it was among the most difficult things he ever did, not because the task of creating the controller was hard, but getting Ken Kutaragi to agree on the design. I have worked at Sony for 20 years now, but there's never been such a difficult product. The controller was considerably harder to design than the console. Goto felt that a system as revolutionary as the PlayStation needed to have a controller that was equally as revolutionary. Ken Kutaragi, on the other hand, felt that the controller would be too difficult to use, and wanted the design to reflect the simplistic nature of the Famicom. This was something Goto and Ken Kutaragi butted heads on constantly during that development time. Sony President Oga was actually the final deciding factor on the controller's design. The controller's ergonomic focus was a pretty dramatic departure from a lot of the flagship controllers that were prevalent in the industry. Only more obscure controllers conformed to the extreme ergonomic support. The controller was designed to be light and sturdy, with handles for the user's hands to rest on comfortably during extended play periods. The controller went through a number of revisions before landing on the final design, but the controller's design was tested again and again to make sure what they had was the best possible option for the PlayStation. And that controller design was so successful that its design survived several console generations with only minor changes. Goto had designed the controllers by carving acrylic foam into different form factors and testing how they felt in his hands. He found that, with traditional controller designs, he would often grip much more tightly, leading to hand fatigue. He started to notice that when he did a more ergonomic design, the controller fatigue would subside, and he'd achieve a much more comfortable experience. Goto's thinking was that he wanted a controller that would be held as naturally as possible. There was actually concerns at Sony that game creators wouldn't like the controller, but Goto had done focus testing with children who had used Famicom controllers exclusively. The children found the controllers to be a bit uneasy at first, but soon, the children became comfortable with the design and began using the ergonomic grips in different ways. Kutaragi and Goto still fought about the issue, but Oga got involved and made a decree on the matter. As far as I can see, the grip-style controller is very easy to use, something that children and adults alike would enjoy using. Stop arguing and adopt this design. He even went on to declare, "I'm the president, so you must do as I say, otherwise you're all fired." Sony at that time had a culture of respecting designers. Goto's design was finally adopted, and it was a massive success. It was stated later that the controller is credited as a large part of the PlayStation's success, leading Oga to boasting to Ken Kutaragi about the matter. Ken Kutaragi said, "You were right about the controller. I was right about the CD caddy and everything else." Buying friends and influencing people. Sony made its first purchase of an in-house development team, the Liverpool-based developer Psygnosis. That purchase led to a substantial boost in Sony's library for launch titles and a large talented pool of developers to assist in creating their dev kits. Sony was originally going to release an expensive workstation-based dev kit, but Psygnosis team members pitched the idea of a much cheaper PC-based solution. Sony was so impressed with the cheaper PC-based solution that they abandoned the expensive workstation designs. The cheaper kits led to a more inclusive development model for Sony, allowing more studios to buy PC-based options, which was a net positive for Sony as it led to more games in the development chute, expanding the system's library even more. During this console generation, Sega and Nintendo blundered quite a bit and didn't provide enough support early on, and the number of third-party developers attracted to the Saturn and later N64 suffered as a byproduct. Sony was playing their cards extremely well, and at this stage in the console's development they were playing them masterfully. The PlayStation, like the CDI and 3DO respectively, used CDs as their primary means of media. The CD allowed for dramatically more storage space, opening up considerably more room for game developers to play with. The PlayStation's use of CDs did offer a unique advantage for Sony, as they owned the capabilities of producing them in vast quantities. Sony was leading with the right foot forward, even with their developer kits, offering robust programming libraries for developers, something that made the lives of third-party developers easier, with Psygnosis working on development hardware, and Namco assisting with robust libraries for assets. The PlayStation was more than ready. Sega blundered in that area, as they didn't initially offer substantial resources like that when they launched the Saturn, leaving a lot of third-party developers high and dry in that arena. Sega also caused a lot of issues when 32X and Sega Saturn development kits arrived at the same time, causing a split in resources among developers and Sega themselves. Sony had assembled a great team, a solid lineup of third-party developers, and a powerful in-house development team. This all proved instrumental in establishing a solid foundation for the system and its eventual launch. Yet the PlayStation was still the new kid on the block, and it was still an unproven product. As to how it would fare with the tech industry and the established players was yet to be seen. 1, 2, 3, 4. December 3rd, 1994. The launch of the PlayStation was an immediate and stunning success, with 100,000 PlayStations moving within the first 24 hours, and 2 million units moving within the first 6 months. Establishing the PlayStation as having serious staying power, Sony dedicated serious resources behind the PlayStation launch, and empowered their marketing teams as such. They brought on experienced team members from other Sony products to assist, and they had a very successful marketing strategy. And that strategy had people lining up by the thousands. While it is true the Saturn was outselling the PlayStation at least at first, thanks to Virtua Fighter, those numbers didn't stay true, as the PlayStation soon took on a life of its own. And by the end of December, the PlayStation had sold 300,000 units compared to the Saturn's 500,000. But the PlayStation was gaining. Now Sony just needed to make that same magic happen again, in the United States. May 1st, 1995. The stage was set for Sega to release their next-gen console, the Saturn. Something that Sega of Japan was heavily invested in launching early, to beat the Sony PlayStation to the American market. Sega wanted to be the first major 32-bit system out of the gate. Granted that the 3DO was on the market, but it was still fighting its high price point. But Sega was set to launch, and take all the glory for itself. E3 was supposed to be that moment for Sega. And E3 of that time wasn't the showy spectacle it would later become at its peak, with game trailers and mass marketing. It was an insider industry event for revealing new products and games. Very much a business event instead of the glamour show it would eventually become in the early 2020s. It was men in suits and ties talking about sales numbers and purchase orders. So very much a trade show at that point. Sony, however, pulled something rather impressive. Sega took the stage at E3 to talk about the Saturn. They had yet to release the price point, as Sega was still internally figuring that out before they gave the speech. The system was expensive to produce, and Sega had to decide how much they were willing to lose on the console and make up in game sales. Sega landed on $399, a tad high for the time as it put the console in the hi-fi spectrum of electronics. But Sega really couldn't afford to eat that much in a loss, at least initially. Sega announced their $399 price point on stage, only to be followed by Sony's Steve Race, who took the stage and simply said,
$299.
Sony fired the first, very effective shots in the new 32-bit console war. Sega had planned that they would launch the Saturn right after the E3 announcement. They thought they could beat Sony to market and dominate the next gen. But little did they know they would leave themselves open to Sony's advance, as Sega's hasty launch left them short on stock and it ultimately angered retailers, limiting the number of Saturns. Retailers like KB Toys dropped the Saturn almost entirely. The lower price point announced by Steve Race actually took Sony of Japan by surprise. They were a bit annoyed at the lower price point, as they had been selling their models in Japan at around $399, and they were still selling. However, they could sell better. While Sony of Japan was annoyed at the lower price point, Ken Kutaragi was already planning for the inevitable need to lower the sales price. The console was selling, but the sales in Japan had slowed a bit around that time. Ken Kutaragi knew that they needed to move the needle on the price a bit to go beyond the core group of gamers that had bought the hardware initially. Ken and his team had already designed the next model, which would allow for a $100 price cut. The price reduction was achieved by lowering the number of parts in the PlayStation. It went down to 450 from the original 700. The lower price point allowed them to dramatically undercut the Saturn and drag Sega into a price war that they really couldn't afford. As soon as Sony cut the price and released a cheaper hardware model, the Sony PlayStation sales continued to pick up steam. Sony chose a slow build approach to the North American launch with an initial batch of 100,000 units. The units moved quickly, selling more in 2 days than the Saturn had managed to sell in 2 months. Sony didn't just defeat Sega in North America. They absolutely crushed them on a global scale, with Sony even succeeding in Europe, previously a Sega stronghold. By late 1996, roughly 2.2 million systems had moved into Europe alone. From September 9, 1995, moving forward, the Sony PlayStation did extremely well, launching itself into the gaming market with full force. They achieved this through proper planning, and Sony pushing hard to have the right people in the right positions at the time. But eventually the relationship between Sony of America and Sony of Japan kind of soured, leading to Sony of Japan cleaning house in Sony of America, and they began running the operations by themselves, with most of the marching orders coming directly from the Japanese side of the house. Sony Japan executives forcing themselves to fly back and forth between the United States and Japan frequently to run both sides of the business. Despite this divided focus, the folks at Sony started dominating the game market. The PlayStation 1 launched with 17 titles in the United States, giving it a decent lineup of games. Most consoles fail to have that many games ready in time for launch, but Sony managed it masterfully. Live in your world, play in ours. Sony, seeing their success growing, moved aggressively to support the console marketing. It paid off dramatically, with the console selling out just about anywhere it went. Oga stated that once people started calling and begging for PlayStations for their children, he knew Sony was onto something truly great. There soon reached a point in the late 1990s that the PlayStation was the undisputed king of the home console market. Sega had fallen, and Nintendo tried to bring their own challenger to the fight, but even the mighty Nintendo couldn't dethrone the new juggernaut of home entertainment. The system's new take on the industry established it as a household name. It was now here to stay, and PlayStation would go on to sell over 100 million consoles. Sony didn't even stop support for the console until 2006, at which point the PlayStation had laid the foundation for future generations of Sony consoles, and cemented itself as a key player in the game industry.